Chapter 6, Understanding Assessment Scores. So, in thinking about how to interpret scores for assessments, it's really important to consider how to make sense of these scores in our interpreting. So, for example, it wouldn't really be that helpful to tell a client, oh, well, you got a 20 on your intelligence test. Because just having that score doesn't necessarily mean anything to individuals who are not trained on that particular assessment. And as we know from our ethics, we have to make sure that the clients are able to understand the outcomes of their assessment in context and have the opportunity to ask questions and make meaning of them. And so we use different referencing guides to interpret scores so that clients can better understand them and they make sense, and it's not just some number on a piece of paper that they don't understand. So we have a couple of different ways of explaining and making sense of testing scores. So the first is criterion referenced interpretation. So this is based on some sort of standard of performance. And so there's usually like an absolute term, there's a cutoff score, and there's a certain level that indicates competency in a particular area. So think about intelligence testing. Think about standardized testing, where there's a cutoff score to show that you have understood the information that you need to, and you can maybe move on to the next grade, or you can be in the gifted and talented program, or you're able to be hired for a certain job or get into a program or something like that. So those are criterion referenced interpretation guidelines that are based on some sort of standard of performance score. So then we have norm referenced interpretation, which is used quite a lot in psychological testing. And this compares an individual to a group of other individuals. And so then we get into this idea of norms or norming, which means we have to understand the group of people who our client is being compared to when we look at their scores for their test. So generally, we don't see a mixture of criterion referenced and norm referenced interpretation on the same test. This is not really recommended. Typically, your assessment will be one or the other. Now, you might put together a battery of tests that might include a norm reference test and a criterion reference test, but you would interpret and talk about those scores separately from each other. So in talking about norms and norming groups, looking at these norm referenced interpretation criterion, it's important to really understand who this group of people is that have scores being compared to the scores of our clients that we're working with or our students that we are working with. And so it's important as part of looking at reliability, validity, appropriateness of an assessment to make sure that the norming group is appropriate for the client that we're working with. So we want to make sure that in this norming group, and again, norming group refers to the group of individuals with whom the criterion for the test or the assessment is used to judge things like percentile of scores. So this doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to use a whole big group of people at the same time that your client is taking the assessment. What it means is that when this assessment or test was being developed, there was a group of individuals who took it initially, and then their scores were used to develop the scoring and interpretation criterion that are used for future clients who are going to take this. So this group of individuals, this norming group, were probably a while ago. They're not happening right in this moment. They were happening as part of the development of the assessment and the test in the first place. So we have to look at the norming groups, and all of this is available in the manual for any kind of assessment or test that you're going to use. All of this norming information should be included in that manual with the psychometrics. So we want to look at representativeness and consider, is this norm group representative of the population for which the test was written? So wanting to make sure that this norming group represents your client, represents an appropriate maybe developmental age for the type of people who will be using a test or an assessment, thinking about cultural inclusion, so what was the demographic makeup of this norming group, and making sure that it's representative of as many types of people as possible, but certainly the type of person that I'm going to be asking to take this assessment as my client. We want to make sure that that norm group is current. So ideally, these should be remade about every 10 years when assessments are being updated. And so that's why we see different versions of assessments coming out about every 8 to 10 years or so. It's because they are using new norming groups and then making improvements based on that norming information. So they give this assessment to a whole big group of people, they look at the scores, they look at how they answer particular questions, and then they go in, they refine, they add things, they tweak things, they change some of the scoring, and then usually in the manual for an updated assessment, they explain what they've updated and how and why they did that based on norming groups. So we want to make sure that it's current and look up in any kind of assessment that we are using, when was the last time that they remade the norming? When was the last time that they retested things with the norming group? Then we also want to look at sample size. So we want to make sure that they had enough people in this group for it to really be representative of potentially a cross-section of whatever kind of societal group that I'm focusing on. So a lot of these are normed in Western culture, and so the samples are largely pulled from Western societies. It's a common critique of a lot of the assessments and testing that's used in the United States. And so we've talked about before how just translating something in language doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to be accurate or reliable or valid in a different cultural group, in a different country, or even in a different language. So we want to take a look at the sample size, the representativeness, and how current that norming group is to determine appropriateness of norm referenced criterion. So then some other things to consider are the composition of the group. So again, is it culturally inclusive? Size, how large the group was, what kind of inclusion criteria the developers used to identify people to be in the norming group. So what were the requirements for people to be included in this norming group in the first place? And were those inclusion criteria open to a cross-section of different kinds of people, or were they specifically recruiting certain types of people to influence the way the scoring would be for the assessment? So that's something to pay attention to. And then again, the year is really important. So generally, we just want to make sure that the type of person we are asking to take the test is represented in the types of people that were used in developing the test in the first place. So for norm referenced scores, which are in reference to a group of individuals who've taken the test or assessment, we have a couple of different ways that we look at our client's score in reference to those of the rest of the norming group. So we have percentile ranks, which we talked a little bit about in the previous chapter, and we'll get into in a little bit more detail here in just a couple of slides. But this is the client or the test taker's score in relative position to others. And so it usually ranges from 0 to 100 and indicates the percentage of scores in the norming group that were lower than my client or the test taker. Then we have some other standard score options that take a look at things like different ways to describe standard deviation from the mean. So z-scores or t-scores are two different ways to look at standard deviation, or essentially how far away from the mean is my client's score. And then depending on the type of assessment that you're using, there's different meaning associated with being more standard deviations away from the mean, meaning you're further from the mean, or having fewer standard deviations away from the mean in terms of the norming group. So then we also have deviation IQs. So these are often used in intelligence testing. And so we hear these referenced actually quite a lot. So you might hear about average intelligence being an IQ of 85 or a 100 being a really high IQ score. These are referencing deviation IQs that are used in certain types of intelligence testing. And that standard deviation that it's talking about in terms of deviation looks a little bit different depending on the test. Then you have those CEEB scores. These are used in things like the SAT or the GRE, and so they just have different ranges of scores and standard deviations to indicate certain types of aptitude or achievement. Then we have things like STAY-9s and S10 scores, which again are just different ways of describing and looking at standard deviations from the mean, and they're just used in different kinds of testing. In looking at the way that our clients' scores might rank in comparison to the norming group, we have two different options in the way that we would look at this. We have a percentile score, which we've already talked a little bit about. So this is the rank or position of our client relative to the norming group. And so the percentile indicates how many of the norming group scores fall below our client's scores. And so in theory, a higher percentile or higher rank means that you've done better on the assessment than that percentage of people in the norming group. This is based on an assumption of normal distribution, as we've talked about in the previous chapter. And so in something like a scoring report, we would see these indicated by a PR or a percentile indicator as listed here on the slide. So then we would have percentages, which are indicative of a raw score. So this is how many of the questions our person has gotten correct. So if you've gotten 70 out of 100 questions correct, then you would have a 70%, very similar to how we would do scoring in like typical education settings. So again, just a representation of this percentile ranking. So this is how our test taker score is relative to the group scores, and it would rank from 0 to 100th percentile. 100th percentile meaning that they've gotten the absolute highest score, higher than anybody who's ever taken this test. So pretty unusual to get a 0, which means you've gotten lower than anyone who's ever taken the test, or 100, which means you've done better than anyone who's ever taken the test. So we don't usually see scores of 0 or 100th percentiles. It's just the range of scores. And so as this figure shows us from the previous chapter, about where those percentages fall are based on that normal distribution. We have those percentages indicated below based on normal distribution. And so where it has the 68, 95, and 99.5%, it helps us kind of get a visual of these percentiles. So down on the far left-hand side of this normal distribution curve, we would start at actually beyond -3 standard deviations would be 0. 0 would be like literally off the chart. But we would start at the lower end there. The mean would be the 50th percentile because it's halfway, right? 50% of people have done worse than our client. So the mean, in this case, 0 standard deviations, would be 50th percentile. And then we would add going up from there. So anything below the mean would be less than 50th percentile, and then anything above the mean would be more than 50th percentile, and then we would just kind of do the math to help understand. So for example, 34th percentile would be about 1 standard deviation below the mean. So this normal distribution curve can help us just sort of visualize how our client has scored relative to others, and it's not uncommon in testing that uses percentile rankings to give an example of this normal distribution curve with your clients indicated on there, or having some sort of visual that shows what percentile means for the individual who's taken the assessment. So we've already talked about most of these different types of scores for norm referenced criterion. But I do want to highlight grade and age equivalent. So grade equivalents are norm reference scoring that talk about academic achievement in each grade. So this is comparing your client who's a fourth grader to all other fourth graders. And so it's easy to misunderstand what these scores might mean, and you have to put them in context of, like, in comparison to other fourth graders, here's how your student has done. Then for age equivalency, we would look at that child in reference to others that are of their same age. And then there's some argument in testing and assessment that we should start considering not just numerical age, but developmental age, because not all children who are 6 are at the same developmental level. You know, we hear people talk about a young 6 or an older 6. And so there's some argument in some of the new ways that testing and assessment is being developed that we should actually figure out a way to norm criterion based on developmental age as opposed to numerical age equivalent. So then we have all of these other options for standardizing testing scores based on standard deviation and means, which looks a little bit different depending on the type of assessment that you're using.